for joining us today. Today's presentation will focus on the future of identity management in Australia. The federal government has prepared the Trusted Digital Identity Bill, which is expected to pass into law later this year. The goal is to unlock economy-wide productivity gains by changing the way in which identity is managed and governed in Australia. Fpos Australia is a familiar name to most consumers and businesses and a key partner of FinTech Australia. connectID is an initiative of Fpos that is designed to play a key role in the transition to the new identity model. Here to introduce connectID and explain how the connectID identity exchange will change identity management in Australia is the Head of Partnerships and Growth for connectID, Nicholas Giurietto. Over to you, Nicholas.
Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks, Rehan, for the introduction and the opportunity to join you all today and share some news about connectID. As you'd expect, I have a slide deck, so I'm going to pop that on in just a moment. And also, importantly, in 20 minutes or so, I'll actually show you the functioning technology so you can see for yourself exactly how this solution will work. So if you excuse me just for one moment, I will line up the presentation and we will get going. Come on. I don't think you can you all see that screen? I think it's on now.
Yes, we can.
Great. Sorry about that. There was a moment of tech drama. So my name is Nick Giurietto. As I said, we're going to be talking about connectID and the role that we aim to play in the new digital identity ecosystem. And I guess the beginning point for all of this is, as Rehan mentioned at the beginning, there's a significant piece of legislation that is due to go before the Parliament later this year. It's unlikely to go before the election, but is certainly one of the priorities from, we understand, both sides of Parliament, of politics, for an after-election legislation. And that is the Trusted Digital Identity Bill, which obviously will become the Trusted Digital Identity Act. And it is intended to implement a new model for the way in which identity is managed in Australia. And the goal of this is actually productivity gains across the whole economy. So the way citizens interact with government, the way citizens interact with business, and business with business. And the heart of it, as you can see from this slide here, is that it is intended to replace the current model where we as individuals need to verify identity and verify credentials with every different organization that we deal with a pre-identified or pre-verified identity and credentials that can simply be shared. And that sharing model, changes the economics, changes the customer experience, and also, as you'll see, has the opportunity to change the compliance model behind that. So the Trusted Digital Identity Scheme, which will be the system that will be set up behind the Act, aim to deliver these goals for consumers and for businesses. So what is Fpos doing in all of this? So the role that we plan to play is through connectID. And connectID is a corporate venture of Fpos, set up more than almost 2 years ago now, and through a series of pilots and MVPs, met some key milestones late last year, and is now available in production as the digital identity broker. And I'll explain in a moment a bit more detail about what that means. So if you look at this diagram down here on the bottom left of the slide, it really lays out the ecosystem. And I'll go into a bit more detail shortly, but the thumbprints on the right represent so-called identity service providers. So these are organizations that will become the custodians of your and my digital identity information. Wallet providers, if you like, although that's not an exact label that's fully accurate. And in that digital identity service provider, you or I as a citizen or individual will be able to store any information about ourselves that we would like to be able to share. It's going to take a while to reach that full scope, but that's the ambition. On the left-hand side, the little sort of business icons there represent businesses or other organizations, including government bodies, that want to have access to trusted information, verified information about their customers or stakeholders. And of course, the consumer, the identity owner, needs to be in charge of this transaction. So the imagery there represents the fact that everything is done with the customer's consent. And obviously that's essential under the Privacy Act. And connectID sitting in the middle there plays a really key linking role in this ecosystem, which is providing, if you like, a hub to bring together those identity service providers and the relying parties, as the jargon is, the merchants, the companies that want to be able to access that information. And if you imagine for a moment this diagram without that central role, whether it's played by connectID or anybody else, what you end up with is all of those parties on the left, the relying parties, and there'll be way more than 3 of them, ultimately perhaps 100,000 of them, would have to build and maintain direct relationships with the dozen or so, which is what we expect to see, identity service providers. And that becomes a pretty big overhead if you're a business, particularly if you're a small business. How do you maintain those connections? Or alternatively, do you have to choose 1 or 2 and risk losing out on a customer relationship where the customer has their identity credentials stored somewhere else? So by having connectID playing in the middle, our role is simply as rails, as a connector. And what we do is we connect through a simple API all of those relying parties with any and all of the identity providers that have been certified to join the scheme, and we maintain those links, keep them up to date, and importantly, we manage some of the compliance flows through the network as well. And once that's all rolled out, as you'll sort of see, hopefully in the remainder of this presentation, we do expect to see 3 really significant gains over the current identity model. First and most importantly will be an enhanced customer experience. By sharing information rather than verifying information afresh, there's an opportunity to simplify and streamline the customer experience. That's one of the reasons why costs for business will go down, although there are more, and I'll explain those shortly. And really importantly, there's also the ability to simplify and really create genuine accuracy around proving compliance. And at the moment, connectID is currently the only private sector exchange that has been certified by the Digital Transformation Agency to provide this service. There are some others that are in the pipeline, and ultimately this ecosystem could include more players, and that's actually a good thing. But as of today, we're the only organization that has achieved that certification, which was done late last year. And why is Fpos playing in this? Just to sort of explain that relationship. Fpos is obviously a well-known brand and has been operating for 40 years or almost 40 years in the Australian payment system. And really it's that capability and that background that we bring to the operation of connectID. Because if you think about the model I was just describing as connectID playing this broker role, this hub role in the middle of these transactions, it's exactly what Fpos has been doing for 30-something or 38 years, I think it is. Right? When you bring a debit card to a store in Australia, whether that's in person or online, no one cares what bank issued the card, and no one cares what bank the merchant has their account with. It's Fpos's job to seamlessly move the money from where it is to where it needs to be. And that's exactly what we'll be doing with identity, is moving the identity information from where it is, the identity service provider, to where it needs to be, the relying party, the merchant that wants access to that information. And if you unpick that, it's in our DNA, is I guess the the pitch that we're making here as to why it's something we feel we know how to do. And if you sort of unpick that a little bit, some of the strengths that running that payments network brings to this new identity network are actually all the same requirements. First of all, the Fpos payments network, it operates a high security, high availability, high throughput network. It doesn't go down. It can't go down. It's national economic infrastructure, right? And the connectID infrastructure operates at the same standard because managing identity will be just as important as managing payments. A bit more subtly, but really importantly, there's a legal structure that underpins the way Fpos manages payments, which gives all of the participants in that system clear visibility as to what their obligations are and what the obligations and expectations of everybody else is. And that same model, so-called scheme rules, will apply to identity. So it'll be an open network where every participant can understand exactly what it is they have to do and what they can expect from everybody else. And really importantly, what that means is when you join that network, you don't need to do due diligence on every other player because you already have a high level of confidence in the fact that they're meeting their obligations under the network scheme rules. Of course, Fpos is a trusted brand, and we aim to leverage that as we deploy connectID. And we have strong relationships with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of payments merchants. And one of the ways we aim to bring this network up to scale is to use those relationships to make it easy for even really small businesses to be able to access this new identity ecosystem. And finally, because we do operate a big piece of the payments network, we have the opportunity to create products that actually integrate identity and payments in much stronger ways. And that's definitely a key roadmap activity for us. So enough of the advertorial. Let me actually share with you a little bit about exactly how connectID works. And the promise here, simplify how you verify, and whether that's a customer, an individual, or whether that's a business, this whole model is intended to simplify those processes, the consumer experience or the business process. So let's just have a look. I mentioned sort of the benefits. If we dig into that just a little bit more, on the customer experience side, the key benefit is by being able to permission access to information that has already been verified. It's simply a sharing request that the customer has to authorize, and that's far simpler than some of the cumbersome processes that are required today when someone needs to verify their identity for the first time and then repeat times with every new vendor that they deal with. And importantly, it really does put the customer in control. They get explicit consent over exactly what information gets shared, and that consent is actually recorded, which when we get to the compliance side is really important as well. And finally, the customer gets to make the choice as to who the custodian of their identity information is. In some cases, they might choose a government service provider. In other words, in other cases, a private one. Different people will have different profiles for that. And we let the customer make that decision according to what they're most comfortable with. From a business point of view, the reduction in cost, a big part of it comes from the simple fact that a reusable identity, the identity provider can invest in creating and verifying that identity once. And then over time, they get to amortize that cost across the multiple reuses of that, which means that the per transaction cost can decline. Whereas in the model where you have to do a new verification each time, there's an element of fixed cost that has to be recovered for every transaction. Probably more importantly, in some ways, is some of the other cost savings that will come. Being able to eliminate a big part of the manual rework that can happen on the exceptions handling side of the current system takes away a lot of costs. So, those transactions that don't go through automatically, they take a lot more effort to resolve, a lot more time, a lot more expense, and so they cost more. Integration through APIs, and importantly, the compliance side, far more efficient in terms of accessing information. So let me talk about that last point. I mentioned a couple of times the consumer's consent is gathered and stored for each transaction and for each attribute about themselves that is shared. And all of that is available in near real time to the relying party, to the merchant, so that they can show to a regulator that they have got that consent. And importantly, if necessary, the underlying documentation can be retrieved to demonstrate that the identity verification was done at the appropriate standard. Okay, enough of the benefits. Let's talk about how it works. So I mentioned this diagram before, but just to sort of step through the roles a little bit more explicitly. In the jargon, the identity service provider, this is the trusted custodian of the consumer's identity and credential information. Their job is to hold that information secure, to keep it up to date, to allow the customer to access it and correct it. And importantly, they can only release that information when they get a valid customer request to do so. On the other side, the relying party. So this is the organization that's requesting access to that information. And the key thing they need to do is actually obtain that customer's consent, or at least initiate the process to obtain that consent. And we send that request across to the identity service provider. The identity owner, the consumer, their job is to decide whether they do or don't want to share information about themselves. Now, in some cases, if they choose not to share that information, they won't be able to proceed with the transaction, but they are always in control of the decision to say, yes, I am happy to share not only the fact that I am who I say I am, the KYC side, but also attributes such as income or employment status or health records or anything else as well. So they're in charge of that. And then, as I mentioned, the role of connectID is to sit in the middle and basically be the traffic cop that moves the request from where it's originating to the data holder and back again. So let's step through a transaction and then I'll show you how it works in practice. So we start with the identity owner. They're engaging with a relying party, with a merchant online. Perhaps they're trying to sign up for an e-commerce site. Perhaps they're applying for credit. Perhaps they're just trying to book a hotel. Who knows? They're going to request the information. The relying party, the merchant, then sends a sharing request to us. And as part of that sharing request, we obtain the information about who the identity provider is. So we send that request to the nominated identity provider, who then authenticates with the customer that they are actually got control over that identity. So there's an out-of-band interaction where through a PIN number or a password or however, the identity owner verifies that they actually have control over that identity. And then they provide that consent I was talking about to share the information, which flows back through us to the relying party. Importantly, in this whole process, the role that connectID plays is only to route the information. We are not a holder of the identity at any time. So just as in the payment system, Fpos doesn't hold the money, in the identity system, connectID does not hold the identity information. Our job is simply to route it around and to make sure it's done according to the right set of rules. So let me show you. I'm just going to have to jump into another page to do that. You should be able to see future pay. So future pay is obviously fictional, although you might be able to guess a little bit about their business model from what you can see here. So this is a buy now, pay later FinTech, but could be any FinTech that's got a KYC obligation. Right? So if the customer wants to proceed with the transaction, at the moment, before we talk about connectID, there'll be a process that looks a little bit like this, right? We're going to capture some information from the customer. and then get them to provide some identity verification information. Typically, it's a driver's license and/or passport. There are some other options, and then they're either going to have to type that in and submit that for a DVS check, or possibly to meet a high level of biometric binding. They might actually have to scan some of those documents, which involves a bit more consumer activity. So they've got to actually get their driver's license out of their wallet and take a photo or whatever. So there's a fair bit of customer interaction required here. And then in some cases where the DVS match fails, then there's got to be a backup process to try to find an alternative way to verify. Or alternatively, if connectID has been implemented, the customer process might look a little bit like this. The customer wants to go ahead, so they sign up. And what appears is what's called the identity service provider selection box. So this is simply saying, who is it that you want to use or do you want us to check with as the holder of your identity information? Obviously, these are fictional, but what we expect to see in the future is a combination of private sector players. Australia Post and Yoti both already have digital identity solutions that are connected to us. We may see, or we expect to see, the banks playing a role as identity providers, and then also government bodies. So some of these state government check-in apps are capable of becoming identity providers, and we're looking at that. For the moment, I'm just going to show you a fictional provider to demonstrate the functionality. But the transaction I'm showing you is actually a real transaction going through the production broker. So the reference ISP is simply our simulator for one of those identity providers. So click number 2, I say, please go check with whoever it is. And this is the authentication phase. So in this case, a username and password is being requested so that it's Jessica here can prove that she does have access to the system. In reality, that's much more likely to be a PIN number or face recognition on your phone, as we're all familiar with doing with check-in apps, for example. So click number 3, I say, yes, I am authorized to access this. And then comes up the consent screen. Are you happy to share these pieces of information about yourself? Right? This is a pretty straightforward profile, but over time, the range of information that could be shared is going to extend to be virtually limitless. So click number 4, I say, yes, I'm happy to share. And now here I am back on the FuturePay website. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's a message here that says that it's Jessica Miller, that her identity has been confirmed. And then you can see her details have been populated, including her mobile phone number and email, which were provided through the identity provider, and her address. What you don't see here is her driver's license or passport number. And that's because behind this message here that says your identity has been confirmed, rather than providing the underlying data, the driver's license or passport number, what's provided is what's called an identity proofing level flag. So this is simply a valid record that says that Jessica's identity has been verified according to a particular standard, and I'll come to that a little bit later on. And as a relying party, you can store that information, but you don't need to take on the burden of storing, unnecessary PII, such as a driver's license number or a passport number. So, like me, your driver's license number is probably sitting in dozens, if not hundreds of databases around Australia. And frankly, it's useless information, right? Almost nobody that I deal with actually needs to know that I'm allowed to drive. And even those who know that, even those who have that need, they certainly don't need to know my actual driver's license number. It's just information that they become the custodian of and they have to protect as PII becomes an identity threat vector. Far better to simply have this flag that says, yes, the identity has been verified at the required standard, and you can store that. So that's the demo. I'm going to just go back to some slides, which you should be able to see again in a moment. And then hopefully we'll have time for some questions as well. So let's just have a quick look at those three value propositions I mentioned before. And I just wanted to draw out a little bit of the detail between the new experience and the existing model. And probably as far as the customer experience is concerned, the really important thing is that the customer invests in verifying their identity once. So they do that work with their identity service provider. And, you know, some of the painful processes that we're all familiar with, where sometimes when things go wrong, it can be hard to you know, get a DVS match or whatever. They do that work once, they get through that, and then they've got a verified identity that's now accessible again, simply with a click, like I showed in the demo. And importantly, what that means is you get a 100% match rate for the sharing requests, because the customer is self-identifying to access the identity information that they have already stored. So there's no risk of, you know, some of the match issues that arise when people use a DVS-based system. And because they're sharing, it's simpler than having to go through that verification process with each new merchant. I don't know about you, but, you know, I have a PNG file of my driver's license and my passport stored on my desktop, and you know, when I need it, I've got to go find that and upload it so that I can use that image to help justify my criteria. Don't need to do that anymore, right? I just provide the sharing permission. And importantly, for the 20%, 15% of transactions that currently don't succeed on first try through the DVS, there's no need to have some sort of manual backup that can often be really frustrating from a customer point of view. And if you flip that into the business side, on the costs, you reduce the risk of customer drop-off because they're much less likely to face those sort of user experience problems, which means that your marketing investment in getting them to your site is more likely to pay off. As I mentioned, the economies of scale from a reusable identity will over time drive down the costs as well. And from a business point of view, you don't have to manage that 15 or 20% of manual exceptions that fail the DVS. And on the compliance side, behind the system is a transaction log where every single transaction is accompanied with metadata that describes exactly what information was provided, the fact that the consent was obtained, and if necessary, allows the underlying documentation to be obtained and shared with a regulator under appropriate regulatory authority. So let's talk a little bit about the AML experience in detail, because until now, the process I've described applies to any online experience, but the AML CTF environment obviously is one that's a little more complicated because of the interaction of the AML CTF Act and the privacy rules and so forth. So I'm sure there'll be some AML specialists on this call who will probably shake their heads at my gross simplification here. But the fundamental obligations that someone has in designing an AML program, they boil down to these 4 points. Firstly, you as the relying party, as the merchant, have the obligation to be reasonably satisfied that the person is who they say they are. AUSTRAC doesn't provide too much more help in defining exactly what that means, other than you need to collect those 3 famous pieces of information: the customer's name, date of birth, and residential address. And as you saw, they're standard parts of a customer profile in the connectID ecosystem. And there's an obligation to verify the name and at least one of the date of birth and the address. And that verification has to be done using reliable and independent documentation or reliable and independent electronic data, or some combination of both. And the connectID system, the broader ecosystem, to be fair, has been designed to meet those obligations. And probably a key part of this is the concept of identity proofing levels. And I don't propose to go through this whole slide in a lot of detail, but a really important point from a compliance perspective is that there is a defined framework under the Trusted Digital Identity Framework that allows the level of confidence in an identity to be assessed. So how confident are we that the person is who they say they are? And there's these 6 levels, sort of confusingly named proofing level 1, 1+2, 2+3, and 4. It'd probably be simpler if we just went 1 to 6, but it is what it is. And they range from a very low level of confidence to a very, very high level of confidence. And at the bottom end there, you can see identity proofing level 1, which is unverified and self-asserted. So what does that mean? It means that I am Mickey Mouse number 112233, and that's allowing me to access some basic online system and no one actually cares who I am, and that's fine. At the very top level, identity proofing level 4, currently it would, for example, meet the verification of identity requirements under PEXA for a property transfer. 1+ is an interesting one because it's the one that it's based on one government credential and meets the requirements for proof of age. So for example, we've been doing quite a bit of work, particularly in New South Wales, around proof of age, proof someone is 18 when purchasing alcohol, because there's a legislative requirement to confirm that when buying alcohol online for same-day delivery. And that compliance obligation kicks in on the 1st of June. So that industry is really eager to get a clear standard on that. And then importantly, in the middle here are 2 different or slightly different standards that are designed to meet the AML CTF requirements and perhaps the advanced or the extended customer due diligence that might be required in some cases. And you can see the documentation that's required there. And importantly, in both of those 2 standards, biometric face match is required as part of establishing the identity as well. From a compliance point of view, I think the key message here is that there is a clear, structured, consistent framework that can be used in assessing exactly what level of identity verification you require to meet your compliance obligations. Almost finished. And then 2 final points I just wanted to make about the compliance side. One is the system is designed to meet the principle of minimum necessary disclosure. So as I mentioned, although you can get the customer's permission to have their actual driver's license number, from a minimum necessary disclosure point of view, we would recommend that you simply get a flag that says the person is verified at identity proofing level 2.5, for example. Or let's say in the proof of age example, rather than getting the customer's actual date of birth, you could simply get and store a flag that says, yes, the person is over 18. So you get this option to minimize the amount of data that you actually have to hold and make it only what is essential for the transaction that you're trying to fulfill. And the final point is regarding audit. As I was describing earlier, every transaction comes with a metadata package along with the data payload that allows the full transaction to be retraced and verified if necessary. And you know, many organizations have discovered that there can be a big difference between being compliant and being able to prove that you are compliant. And sometimes that difference can be very, very costly. Whereas the connectID system, because it provides real-time access to the underlying transaction logs and all of that compliance information, it's literally a very trivial exercise to verify that a transaction has been conducted at the appropriate standard. So the final piece, how do we get going? That's a conversation that I'd love to have with many of you one-on-one. But at a high level, there's 2 main things that need to be done. Firstly, on the technical side, we can work with you to provide access to our sandbox. It's all API driven, and certainly in the FinTech community, something that should be very, very familiar to all your dev teams. And we'll support that, with documentation, of course, but also with assistance from our identity solution specialist to make sure that you understand exactly how it works and how to configure it properly. And then before you go live, we work with you to make sure that the system is performing exactly as you anticipate. On the legal side, the commercial side, one of the key things that we have to help you understand is this concept of the scheme rules. The rules that govern the whole ecosystem. So we'll work you through that. Understand exactly what customer attributes that you want and what the price of those are. And then you sign an accession deed, which means you accept that set of scheme rules. And obviously these two threads come together in order to allow you to go live with a new solution. It's expected that this process can take as little as 3 or 4 days, although some of the early partners take a little bit longer just because it's unfamiliar at the moment. So that is the end of the talking head part of my presentation, and thank you for putting up with just a lot of slides and voice for a little while. I will now sort of take the opportunity to ask any questions. I can see that 2 have come through on the chat. And probably is easier just to send a question by chat if you've got one. So the first question I've got here is MyGovID an ISP for connectID service to verify customer name, and who are the candidates for the ISP? So that's a really good question. Thank you, Karthik. MyGovID will be an identity service provider at some point, we hope. There's no technical reason why they can't do that. I think it's a case of when the DTA decides to prioritize that integration to allow that to happen. At the moment, sort of to answer the second question, the identity service providers that we have already piloted and integrated include Yoti and Australia Post. We're working with 2 of the state governments, so I can't name them here, unfortunately, on integrating their apps. And then we're aware of at least 2 identity service provider startups that are coming as well. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the call, we do expect that the banks will probably offer a solution like this over time as well. How does the data get updated? Is your marriage name or address change? Yep. Again, that's a great question. So that obligation belongs to the identity service provider. So the customer will create that will have that relationship with their identity wallet provider. And if they get married, then just as they would do today, they would provide information to allow their name to be updated if that's what they're choosing to do. But crucially, they only have to do that once. So they update it once with that identity service provider, and then any future use, including an update mechanism if they want, can use that one-time effort. Will the services of Rails app double up as an ISP? That's a question that I can't answer. I can't speak for services of Rails. I can say that we've had some detailed discussions with them about that option. Are there any other questions? I see one chat question here, or no, that's the same. If there are any other questions? Okay, so what commercial benefits does the ISP get out of this? That's a really good point too. So thanks again for that question. There's probably 3 different ways that an ISP can benefit, and it sort of depends on the actual brand of that ISP and what their core purpose is. So for some of the potential ISPs, particularly one day the banks, I think it'll be more about customer stickiness and engagement. So if your customer already trusts you to manage their money, then trusting you to manage your identity is a logical extension, but it makes you more present in their life and gives more value. So there's that customer loyalty piece. Many of the potential ISPs are also in their nature big RPs. So it does provide a cost savings benefit on that side, an easy way for them to share that information. And finally, they get paid. So in that model, in that commercial model, for every transaction, each time the identity information is accessed, the ISP gets to charge the merchant for that access. And so they make an investment in verifying the identity and protecting the identity. And then per transaction, they get to first, set off that investment and then move into profit by charging to the point where they've more than covered their original cost. I can see a couple more questions coming through. Is the ISP the identity wallet provider, or could they be different parties? Not quite sure exactly how best to answer that one. So whoever asked that, if they would like to follow up in detail in case I've misunderstood you, more than happy to do that. But the identity provider is the party that's providing the capability to manage your identity. That doesn't have to be done through a wallet, but most likely will be. So usually it will be the same thing. But there are models there where, a wallet provider could act as the technology partner for the ISP or something like that. Is there a set amount of time a verified flag stays active for? And do document expiry dates intersect with this? Again, good question here. It's a bit of detail that I might invite you to contact me specifically on. But the first part of the answer to that question is that the transaction status flag remains associated with that transaction forever. Technically, there's a 7-year retention rule, but at this stage, the capability is intended to go beyond that, although at some point it probably won't be relevant to retain those records. So even up to 7 years or possibly longer, if you need to go back and verify that the transaction was conducted according to the appropriate standards, you can still access that flag. And importantly, you get the flag. You as the relying party get that flag. So you get to store the flag yourself and you can keep it for as long as you want. And do document expiry dates intersect with this? I'm not 100% sure about what you mean about that part. So perhaps that's an offline conversation. Are you concerned that there'll be too many ISPs and identities will not be maintained efficiently? How is the DTA managing this? So I can't speak for the DTA, but we see this as a competitive marketplace where different ISPs will emerge with slightly different value propositions. Some of them will focus really strongly on a super simple customer experience. Some of them will focus on, the brand that they bring and that broader trust relationship, whatever. It's probably not a market that's going to see dozens and dozens of ISPs, maybe 20 or so, at the top. And that'll be a combination of government ones and private sector ones. And really the market will decide. So if customers are unhappy with a particular ISP, then over time they'll move. That's okay. That's the way the markets work. The one thing I can say about how the DTA is managing this is that there is an onboarding process where an ISP has to meet quite stringent security, privacy, other standards before they're allowed to operate. So, there's a threshold there that means that they're capable of operating the service in a secure and trusted way. I think we might be at the end of the questions and we're coming close to the end of the time. Oh, hang on, there's one more. Given there may be competition to achieve superior KYC onboarding experiences, what other plans have been considered for connectID? I'm not 100% sure, again, precisely what's behind that question, but what I would say is, although I focused quite a lot on the KYC component of this discussion, because it's sort of the immediate problem area where there's a lot of opportunity to improve the way we do things. Ultimately, we're talking about changing not only the fact that the identity verification, but crucially the credentials verification. So being able to prove anything about myself that I want to be able to prove. And that could include, for example, sharing verified income or employment status information as part of a credit application. It could include permitting access to my transactional banking history through the CDR so that information can be ingested into an algorithm to decide whether or not I'm a suitable candidate for the product. Or in completely different domains, it could include a COVID safe flag that sits attached to my database so that when I'm booking travel, I don't need to separately verify that I still have the appropriate COVID vaccinations and so forth, or there are a whole bunch of other health use cases. So there's literally an endless array. And ultimately, one of the big games will be linking the KYC and KYB processes, where it will be possible to actually attach certified information about my delegated authorities as an officer of a company and provide proof of that in a digital format. So this will take a little bit of time, but getting to the point where you can radically streamline the onboarding process for a business, because the KYB is simpler rather than the KYC. Is connectID going to be the only hub? We don't know. There are government hubs. So within the ecosystem, Services Australia and the ATO already operate hubs. We're the first private sector hub to be certified as an exchange. There are a few other businesses out there that have declared their intention to become certified, and that's a healthy thing. Importantly, the legal framework for that actually requires the hubs to work together so that you just get a richer ecosystem if others are able to also be certified. Will fees be decided centrally or between parties? They are central. So part of the model of that sort of shared ecosystem actually means that all parties are paying the same price for the same attributes. There is a volume discount schedule attached to that, but what there is not is separate fees for separate types of relying parties or accessing separate data. Okay, I'm conscious we've used up a fair bit of the time and we seem to have used up most of the questions. I might hang on just for a moment or two longer. But if there are no further questions, I guess what I would say is later today or possibly tomorrow morning, you'll get an email through FinTech Australia that I believe will have this presentation attached as a YouTube. It'll also have a PDF of the deck I've just prepared and my contact information. Really happy to reach out for you to reach out to me, and I can provide more detail on these questions or any others about how connectID can work with you. For many of you, that's probably as a relying party, a simpler way to achieve the KYC component of your service. For some of you, it might involve a conversation about whether you would become an identity provider or a credentials provider within that identity ecosystem, and it's of detail we can get into. But there are certainly other ways that people could partner with us as we roll this solution out. So I'm seeing no more questions. So I am going to thank you all for your time. I hope I've got you thinking a little bit about the radical transformation that we expect to see over the coming years in the way identity is managed in Australia, and start to think about what that means for you, the opportunities to interact with that ecosystem as it starts to evolve, to help accelerate that, because they're not only commercial benefits for individual businesses, but going back to where we began this whole conversation, a significant economy-wide productivity benefit to be achieved for everybody if we can make this work properly. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Rehan and FinTech Australia for giving us the opportunity to share our information. And I'll hand back to you, Rehan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks all for joining us. And yeah, going to end the session now. Thanks, Nick.